Hello, welcome to the Wheelbarrow Series class on growing tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. First, we're going to talk about some things that we are going to talk about in this PowerPoint. We're going to talk about site requirements, varieties, growing needs, some bugs, and some diseases that you may encounter with growing these vegetable plants. So why do we love them? Well, they are easy to grow. Three of the probably easiest vegetable crops to grow here in Kentucky. You can eat them raw or cooked. Probably wouldn't want to eat the eggplant raw, but you could if you wanted to. But the other two, the peppers and the tomatoes, as you know, are delicious, either raw or cooked. You can grow them in limited space. You get high yields from these plants. They're low in calories, they're high in vitamin C, and there are a lot of variety out there, probably more than you could ever imagine if you go to look at some of the heirloom seed catalogs. When you want to plant some of these crops, you have to think about getting started with seeds or transplants. A lot of people like to start their own transplants. It's a little cheaper. But why do you want to do it? There's lots of varieties if you buy seeds as opposed to buying transplants. You can buy seeds and get thousands of varieties at your fingertips, so to speak, mailed right to your house. You get most of your heirlooms this way. A lot of the greenhouses and nurseries don't grow as many transplants of heirlooms as they do for the hybrids. Um, as far as being worth your while, you must be able to grow quality transplants. There's no reason to put effort and time in these if you know you can't ahead of time get a good product out of it. As far as transplants go, the best thing about them is that they're ready to go when you are. So you can go to the greenhouse or nursery and buy the plants, bring them home, let them harden off a day or so outside, and then you're ready to plant. Uh, there's no 6 or 8 week waiting period and care for plants to get them to that uh, stage. The biggest drawback, though, is as I was talking about with all the variety you can get with seeds, there is limited variety on buying your transplants because there's limited numbers of varieties that most greenhouses will actually grow. As far as your transplants go, they should be short, stocky plants. You want them to have a dark green color, as you can see in the picture there. A sturdy stem size, uh, or a sturdy pencil-sized stem, I should say. Just a nice, thick, stocky plant is what you're looking for. You obviously don't want to have any disease or insect problems on it. Don't bring home a problem. Also, you don't want them to be fruiting or flowering yet because that's just going to stunt the plant. Some of you may buy a plant that's larger with the flower on it or even a small fruit just so you get an early tomato. That's fine, but don't buy a whole lot of those because these younger plants that are not to that stage yet are going to take off, grow a lot faster, and give you a lot more yield by the end of the season. Some problems you may incur if you do grow your own seedlings. You can have damping off, and you can see in this picture where they're just rotting off. It's also called sudden seedling death. It's caused by soil-borne fungi that actually invades the wet soil, and then it actually rots the roots and the stems of the transplants, and then they die. These are very hard to control once they occur. They can go through a flat of tomatoes or peppers pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that you keep your soil moist but not wet. Make sure you use new trays to start your seedlings in, or make sure that you do a 10% bleach wash on your trays if you do reuse them. Site requirements for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. They are solanaceous crops, all three of them, and they prefer full sun. They're also warm season crops, which means they cannot have any frost. So you're going to make sure you plant those after all frost danger has passed. Well draining soil is a must. A wet soil, you're going to get root rots in there. You need a soil pH of about 6.2 to 6.8, which is pretty much our general native pH around these parts. And you don't want to plant them in a location where tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, or related plants were grown last year because you're just going to increase the risk of more disease problems on these plants if you do that because some of those diseases overwinter in the soil or in the plant debris in the soil. So make sure you do good crop rotation. Even if you've got a small garden, just planting them on the other side of the garden they were last year is going to help quite a bit on this because some of these Funguses get started by splashing up to the bottom leaves, and then that's whenever they start to really grow. You also want to avoid planting near black walnut trees. There's a chemical that is emitted from black walnuts called juglone. It is in the it's emitted from the roots, but it's also in the holes. And so you don't want to plant close to those because that is very toxic to these plants. Tomatoes, particularly, it will kill them, or at the very least stunt them, so you won't get much harvest. There are varieties of, especially tomatoes, two types of growth on the varieties, I should say. There's determinate types, which these do reach a specific height. They stop growing, they flower, and they fruit at the growth tip. They ripen all at once, and then the plant dies. So it's got a big harvest at one time, but there is a short window there, so you don't get tomatoes during the entire growing season. But this is a good choice if you want to can a lot of tomatoes at one time, or you don't want to can multiple times to get a bunch of juice or whatever you're wanting to can with this. This isn't one of the tomatoes that's usually grown for commercial production because they can go in and harvest the entire field at one time. The other variety is the indeterminate. These will increase in height through the season. They'll keep growing. They'll keep producing fruit until something kills them, like frost or disease, insects. Uh, Anything like that is what's going to take them out. They will not stop on their own. One thing, as far as eggplants and peppers go, you do need to continue picking those, or they will stop producing or slow way down if you don't pick them regularly. Tomatoes, not so much, because those tomatoes can actually, when they get ripened, they'll rot and fall off. So the tomato, they're not just hanging there all the time on the tomato. The great thing about indeterminate varieties of tomatoes, though, is you get a long harvest, generally during the entire growing season, which is most of us gardeners prefer to grow these because we don't have to worry about planting multiple crops, and we can get tomatoes all the way into late fall. Some disease resistance to look forward to or look to. Seed packets, whenever you buy them, usually will have the name of the tomato and then a bunch of letters behind it. This is only going to be on hybrid tomato seed because they've had the research and the work done on these by the seed companies, so they can say that they're resistant, which is gives people incentives to buy these year after year. And remember, heirlooms, you can save seeds. Hybrids, you can't. You could save them, but you're not going to get the same plant back year after year like you do with heirlooms. So if you see there after big beef, there's VFFNTA hybrid. That means that this variety of tomatoes, a very good tomato, very flavorful tomato, it is resistant to verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, and nematodes, and also tobacco mosaic virus and I guess alternaria. As far as your plant spacing, it depends on which varieties you're planting. Also depends on if you're planting eggplants or tomatoes. But generally speaking, spacing of 1.5 to 2 feet apart for small bush types of tomatoes, sometimes called patio tomatoes. That may also be adequate for some peppers and some eggplant. For the most part, it's not going to be enough room. The larger plants, 3 to 4 feet, uh, generally about that much room unstaked. I'm going to stake all of these crops because the tomatoes and eggplants, or I mean the peppers and eggplants, once they get a large load of fruit on them, a lot of times they'll blow over if we have one of those heavy thunderstorms in July or August. And then tomatoes obviously are big, so they're going to need to be staked. But if you do stake them, you only need to give 2 to 3 feet apart, or if they're caged, 3 to 4 feet, and in between rows, 4 feet. Don't crowd your rows. Make sure you give yourself plenty of room between rows. I know when you plant these plants, it seems like they're really far apart, but as they grow, they can grow quite large and even grow together. Don't make the mistake I made last year and ended up having to crawl under the tomato trees to pick the tomatoes. And then, like I said earlier, I like to cage the peppers and eggplants or stake them, whichever one you prefer. I usually put a small cage around and then actually have a stake there where the cage won't blow over. Then we're on to planting. You can set your tomatoes a little deeper than they're actually growing because their stems will root quite easily. This is very important if you've got a leggy plant and you want to just kind of shorten it down where it won't break off in the wind. It's not a must. Research shows they don't grow any more tomatoes in the growing season if you bury them deeper or if you plant them in the same height. Usually it's just to help that stem strengthen up. On as far as peppers and eggplants, you want to plant those just barely deeper than they were growing in their container. They don't root quite as well on that stem as tomatoes do, and you don't want to set some root rot or stem rot in. Also, when you plant, you can put a high phosphorus starter fertilizer in if you want to do that at 6-10-4, 5-10-5, or you could even use some of the Miracle Grow or any other water soluble fertilizer just to give a little kickstart to these plants. You do want to water them well at planting. One thing, don't ever put a dry root ball in the soil. Make sure you water them well before you take them out of the container to plant, because you want that root ball to be moist going in, and then you're going to put more water around it. Also, go ahead and set your cage or your stakes out as right after or within a few days after planting your tomatoes, because inevitably you'll get busy and 2 weeks will have gone by and your plants are going to be already growing and falling over, and they're going to be harder to actually get them into the ground. Now we're on to training. You can do cages. Cages are great because they support all sides of the plants. You can get different sizes of them. There's no need to remove suckers, which I don't remove suckers on tomatoes anyway, and then obviously you don't on peppers or eggplants. You will get fewer cracks and sunburn because that foliage will shade the fruit and keep that hot sun off of it. You also get fewer green shoulders, which is better ripening, and you can make your own of these. You can buy some fencing and make your own, or you can buy the expensive ones that they're showing in the picture there that collapse down and fold up well. Most of us probably are just going to make our own out of some fencing. One thing I have found a lot of times the cages are not tall enough, so if you can find some tall enough fencing, that's great. Or you can just let the tomatoes grow up through the top and fall over, which is what a lot of people do. But usually by that point they're already in full swing of canning and freezing things out of the garden, so they're not that worried about losing some production off of those. And obviously you're going to use shorter cages for peppers and eggplants. Other methods, you can do staking with just drive some stakes in the ground and then tie the tomatoes or peppers up to them or eggplants up to them. This keeps the plants off the ground, which don't ever grow tomatoes without having them at least supported off the ground, because you're just going to reduce your yield and increase your likelihood of disease and varmints, terrapins or anything else can get to your tomatoes if they're right on the ground. Staking does require twine, which you will need to tie the plants up to it. What I usually do is just tie it up, and as the plants grow, I'll just start growing, letting the suckers grow, and just tie more string around. And it looks like a mess for a little bit, but it holds the plants up. You can prune or desucker if you like. I don't do that. It may make a little tidier appearance, but again, there are some drawbacks to suckering. As far as, first of all, that's a lot of work that you have to stay on top of. Third of all, you're going to get a lot more sunburned tomatoes that way, a lot more cracking that way, a lot more green shoulders that way. And then that's just, for me, it's just like it's more work, and I'd rather have a lot of tomatoes than just some perfect big ones, which is usually why they stake tomatoes and suckers, just to get some larger tomatoes. Not suckering, you're going to get a lot more tomatoes, may not get the huge tomatoes that you're looking for. So fertilizing, obviously, we're going to tell you to go ahead and do a soil test now. Remember, in Washington County, it is free to bring your soil in and get it tested right now. You're going to put whatever that soil test says down first and work that into your soil. And then at planting, you're going to use a high phosphorus starter fertilizer. Again, that's going to be something like the water-soluble fertilizers like Miracle Grow or Peters or any of the generics. They're all fine now. As long as they melt in water, you're fine. And then when the first fruit is golf ball size, you're going to put about a tablespoon of urea 6 to 10 inches in a circle around each plant. Or if you have your plants planted in a row, that adds up to about a pound of urea per 100 foot of row. Remember, you're going to want to put half a pound on one side and half a pound on the other. That way you're kind of getting an even distribution of that urea around the plant. And then you're going to repeat after 2 weeks after picking the first ripe fruit. And then 6 weeks after picking your first ripe fruit, you're going to do that again. So all this is doing is just giving that plant a little more food, a little more nitrogen to tell it to grow a little more foliage. That way you'll keep getting more tomatoes. But remember, don't go over this recommended amount, because if your soil is too rich, you'll get all plant and no flowers and fruit. You'll have tomato trees with no fruit and flowers, and no one wants that. far as watering, definitely want to water thoroughly at transplant. Remember what I said earlier, don't put a dry root ball in the soil first and then try to moisten it. Go ahead and water that plant while it's in the container, and then put more water around that plant as you're planting in the planting hole. Uh, these plants are all going to need about an inch to an inch and a half of water per week. That inch and a half, if it's really hot, it's probably going to be on that mark. If it's just regular summer days, about an inch. But if we can keep it in that ballpark, that's going to reduce a lot of other problems that we'll discuss here in a minute. Don't let your moisture fluctuate too much. We'll talk about why just in a second. Mulching is very important. I will never put tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, any of those things out without some mulch. It prevents weed germination, which is going to be a lot of help for you to keep you from having to go out and spend all the time and hard work of keeping the weeds down. It moderates the extremes in your soil moisture, which is great because that's going to keep from getting some of those blossom end rots and some other issues that might occur. Also moderates your soil temperature, which keeps it from fluctuating. That's really good in the early part of the spring because you want to make sure those plants are staying warm, even those roots are staying warm. And it also aids in disease control because it reduces the splashing of water and soil up onto those bottom leaves. And usually, a lot of the diseases that affect this group of plants can overwinter in the soil. And whenever that soil is splashed back up onto those leaves, that just lets it go ahead and get started. And then it can sporulate and spread through the air to the rest of the plant. So if we can keep that splashing from occurring, we can keep those disease instances down. What kind of mulch do you want to use? You can use any kind of organic material you would like. You could use straw. You could use grass clippings. Just remember that if you do use grass clippings, make sure that yard was not sprayed with a weed control such as 2,4-D, because that can come through to your garden, and tomatoes are very susceptible to 2,4-D, and it will curl them. So if you use that, make sure it's in a yard that's not sprayed for weeds. Black plastic is my preferred one for these three crops because they all three like hot weather. It is easy to put down one time. Uh, well, one time each growing season, and all you have to do is run you a soaker hose down, stick the ends out, cover over the edges of the plastic, and then plant right through it with your tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, and then you're good to go for that season. As far as weed control, you do want to make sure you keep your weeds down out of your garden. It greatly will reduce your total production. They compete for water, nutrients, sun, and space, just like anything any other plant would do. They also can harbor diseases and insect pests that can harm your vegetable plants. So how do you control these? Purchase weed-free seed. That's not a big issue for this group of plants we're talking about, but it could be if you're doing seed corn or something like that. You do want to prevent weed seed set, so don't get 3/4 away of the season and decide that you're done gardening and let the weeds take your garden and let them all go to seed, because you'll be fighting those next year and maybe up to 10 or 20 years later, because those seeds all have different dormancy requirements and whenever they're going to germinate. Go ahead and keep your borders clean as well, because those seeds can spread into your garden from the sides of the field. And void infested soils, that's not always easy to do. If it's a new garden, you don't know what was there before, you're just going to work through that over the couple of seasons as you're growing there. And then another one is avoid weedy transplants. Don't bring a transplant home with weeds already growing in it. Just leave that at the greenhouse. Pick a different plant or pick a different greenhouse if that's the case. There's no reason to bring home a problem that you're going to have to fight later. Other tips, how to control your weeds by hand. Obviously, in small areas, you're just going to pull those out. You make sure you mulch when possible. That's maybe hard to do with something like sweet corn, but it's easy to do for tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and those types of things. You may want to do some limited use of chemical control, which you can also do this in combination with hoeing and mulching. If you're in a new garden, you've got a lot of perennial weeds coming up. Those roots are in the ground and they didn't get taken out by plowing or working with the tiller. You may have to spot spray with a little Roundup on some of those. Also, herbicide drift can be a problem, so make sure that you're not using any kind of, especially 2,4-D near your garden, because if the wind's above 5 miles an hour and the temperature can be up in the 80s and 90s, that stuff can spread for quite a ways, maybe up to 2 miles. So these crops are all very sensitive to it as well. And then we come to pre-emergence and post-emergence. Pre-emergence just means controlling the weeds before they germinate. And that is putting something down like a pre-emergent such as preen. which actually is labeled to use in a lot of these vegetable gardens. Um, just know that if you're using a pre-emergent, you've got to put your transplants of your vegetable plants out first before you apply the pre-emergent. And then you can't plant seeds into that, because if you plant vegetable seeds into that, it'll kill them as well. And then post-emergence is just basically actively taking those weeds out as they're growing by hand pulling, hoeing, however you need to get those out of there. As far as harvesting tomatoes, vine ripen is just fully finished right on the vine, and then there's pink stage there. You can see that picture. There's not quite that pink, but that's we can see the little color there at the end of the tomato. You can finish that off the vine, and honestly, you will tell no difference in the taste of that tomato than the one that you fully finished on the vine. Generally, over 86 degrees, the red won't develop. The fruit may be more of a yellow orange instead of a good deep red, even though that's the variety that you're growing. That's not a problem. It doesn't affect the flavor or anything. That's just a cosmetic thing that, maybe a little more orange than red's no problem. When frost is getting close, go ahead and harvest all of these, bring them indoors. A lot of these will go ahead and ripen up. They may not be as good as they would if they had already had a little pink stage started on them on the plant, but they're still going to be quite a bit better than anything that you can buy from the store. Peppers can generally be picked at any stage for flavor. However, the flavor is best, and it is best to allow them to get to their normal, full, mature size. Most of them will keep a lot longer if you do let them get to their mature size, because those walls, the cell walls are thicker and they hold more moisture and they can last longer in the refrigerator. Most peppers will start out green and then turn their yellow, orange, purple, or red when mature. That's generally why the yellow, orange, and red peppers or bell peppers are a little more expensive at the grocery store, because they had to stay on the vine longer. And if you want to dry peppers for storage, go ahead and allow them to mature on the plant and then pick those off and then go ahead and dry those. As far as eggplants go, the key to harvesting eggplant is to never allow them to become over mature. That flesh, all the seeds are embedded in the flesh of that eggplant, and if you let them become over mature, they're hard, like a pepper seed, except there's a lot more of them in there, and basically makes that eggplant inedible. So harvest them a little younger. Don't let them mature completely on the plant, because you don't want big seeds in it. That's just not good to eat. And then eggplants do come in different colors, but generally real mature, whatever color they start on the plant. So if they start out purple, they're going to mature purple. If they start out white, they're going to mature white. Believe it or not, there's some light green ones and some orange ones and some other colors out there as well. Environmental stress disorders, blossom end rot is one that's very common. You can see the pictures there. It can be on any fruit. Basically, you see a lot more on tomatoes, probably you do the other plants, but you can even get these on squash. You can see the peppers there, eggplants, any other thing, any plant that produces a flower can have that. It's a dry black leathery scar at the end, which is opposite of the stem. This generally is caused by a calcium deficiency from extremes in soil water. Now, they used to think that meant your soil didn't have enough calcium, but that's not true. Here in our part of Kentucky, we have very high calcium. So our problem is not that our soil doesn't have calcium. Our problem is that the plant can't get the right amount of calcium when it wants it. So when it's actively growing, if it doesn't have enough calcium for leaves, it takes the calcium out of the skin of the fruit, and then the fruit rots. So this is most serious whenever we have hot, dry weather, or we don't or we have too much water. And what happens is the plant just can't get a regulation on the amount of calcium. So how do we remedy that? There are no sprays or anything you can do for these, but we remedy that by putting our mulch down, which is going to regulate our soil moisture and keep it even. And also, if we have a dry spell, we're going to irrigate, but don't let it get too dry before you irrigate, because then you're going to cause some other issues we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the main thing to stop most of this blossom end rot is going to be putting down a mulch. As far as blossom drop goes, this is generally caused by temperature extremes. Fruit set when night temps are about 55 to 75 degrees. Anything out of that range can cause the blossoms to drop. People can spray this chemical on there to hold that blossom on there a little bit longer. Don't do that, because if you do that, any flower that is pollinated, especially on the cool range of this fruit set, is what we call you're going to a misshapen tomato on the opposite end of the stem, which we call cap facing, and that's just not good. So my thing I do is just let nature take its course. The weather will straighten out. The plants will keep growing. They'll keep putting out new flowers, and you'll get plenty of fruit. Here's fruit cracking. This generally occurs during rainy, hot weather when it's above 90 degrees. It can occur after a long dry period and then rain, which sometimes they'll crack like the top and the bottom tomato, or even the eggplant, which is unusual for eggplant to do that, but it can happen. But a lot of times they'll crack and then rot. But sometimes they crack if they're closer to green when this happens, and they just heal over. Then you have these cracks. All you do is just cut that part off and eat the rest of it. Obviously, if you're growing for commercial productions, you have to throw those away. But as home gardeners, we don't have to worry about that. Then we have sun scald. This is just what it's called. These plants are sunburned, or these fruit are sunburned. It starts out as a white or yellow patch, and then the patch blisters and dries, and then the fruit generally rots, especially a tomato because it's a softer fruit. Peppers can maybe half of it can survive, and then eggplant generally rots as well. This is all from poor foliage cover, um, which, if we have a hot, dry spell, poor foliage cover could come from a myriad of reasons, but this is when I talked about not suckering your tomatoes because you're taking that foliage off, and then say we have a disease outbreak and more of that foliage has gone off, and then this fruit is hanging out there in the full sun in a hot weather, and they just sunburn. The same happens with peppers and eggplants as well. So this is going to be hit or miss depending on the season. Some years it's really bad. Some years you never see a fruit do this, but the way to remedy that is to keep your foliage on your plants and to water during your dry spells. Here we have blotchy ripening. Basically, it's just uneven color develops from cool temperatures or root stress. Also, it can be caused by low potassium, easy for me to say. This is another reason to go ahead and get your soil test done because you'll know how much fertilizer to put down. So we can rule out the low potassium if you've put down the correct amount of fertilizer. As far as the cool temps or the root stress could be from lack of water or even more likely some root rot or something like that. And also cool temps, that'll straighten out on its own generally if it's an early spring, but it can happen in the fall as well. Poor fruit set is another problem people have. Generally, again, it's temperature extremes. If it's too hot or too cold, the flowers can fall off. If you have dry soil, obviously they're not going to set fruit because they just have enough moisture to grow fruit, so it's just not going to set. If you have too much shade, another problem is make sure you put your plants where they're getting at least 5 to 6 hours of full sun. I'd prefer more than that if you can get it, give them that. And then excessive nitrogen is another problem. Uh, if they get too much nitrogen, that nitrogen is telling that plant to grow leaves, grow leaves, grow leaves. Don't do anything else, and that's what they do. Now we're on to diseases. This is early blight, which hits tomatoes really hard. It does leave these dark brown spots with concentric rings, as you can see in that leaf there at the top, or actually better in the leaf in the middle. You can even see the rings in the stem down there, which usually when it goes on the stems, you've got a pretty bad infection starting on your leaves. It does begin on the lower foliage and then moves up. The leaves will shrivel and die, and the plants will defoliate, leaving your fruit there with poor fruit set, sun scalded fruit, and the fruit won't size up, obviously, without leaves to make food for that fruit. An example of disease resistance, we talked about this earlier, but you can see this is just Better Boy here. It's right off a package of seeds. This one will outproduce just about anything else in Kentucky over the long haul of the entire growing season. They know this because they have done some tests with actually weighing the amount of fruit for the season. This doesn't produce huge tomatoes, but it produces a lot of them. And you can see there, this one is resistant to verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, race 1, and nematodes. So why did I show you that? Have you noticed that it is not resistant to early blight? Well, there's a reason. There is no tomato out there that's fully resistant to it. Some of the commercial varieties are a little more resistant to it than our homegrown types. But as you know, those commercial types of tomatoes don't taste very, very good. And if you've ever grown them thinking that you could ripen them on the vine and they would taste like the other tomatoes, they still don't. So how to control early blight? You want to maintain proper fertility. That way you know that plant is actively growing. Spray your foliage at your first sign of disease with chlorothalonil, Manab, Mecazeb, or fixed copper. I'll go a step further and tell you as soon as you see a few leaves on the bottom of that plant, with those few spots, go ahead and pick those leaves off and take those out of there. Also, never work in your tomatoes while they're wet because if this disease is out there, you're just spreading it around. And then you may need to apply that fungicide weekly as needed. Fixed copper is not as good on these fungal diseases as the chlorothalonil and the mancozeb is, but if you want to go organic, that's pretty much your only option there. And then you want to make a second planting in midsummer if you know you've had a lot of trouble with this and you want plenty of tomatoes to can. You may need to do a second later planting and a little bit away from this current planting that may have a lot of disease in it. And then again, buy resistant varieties when possible, which is really not much option with this particular disease. This is for another one easy for me to say. Fusarium and verticillium wilt. You can see there in the pictures, the plants just wilt and die. A lot of times the tomato and the pepper will wilt and die, but the eggplant, as you can see in that picture, it just gets stunted with leaves yellowing and falling off, but maybe never completely dying. This is a soil-borne disease. It's hit or miss whether you have it or not. The only way to avoid it is to not plant plants that are susceptible to this disease in its area for 3 consecutive seasons. Now that's hard to do because there are weeds that even get this disease, and you may have left out of there with tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, but there was a weed growing there that had the disease, and it's there, and this diseases are still actively growing. Usually the way we tell if it is this disease, we'll cut the stem open lengthwise, and you can see this tomato stem there, where normally the vascular system would be bright white. It's discolored and turned brown, and that's just that fungal pathogen growing up through that root system, up through that vascular system, and it's just clogging it where the plant can't get nutrients up and down in the stem. How do you control these? This is the one that the only way to control it, or fire way to control it, is to plant resistant cultivars. So again, those varieties that have a V or an F on it are going to be resistant to these two. There are more than one strain on a lot of these, but usually you can get by with just one V and one F. Sometimes there's V1, V2, or F1, F2. But for the most part, a V and an F will get you by. Now, this doesn't say that heirlooms, like some of the heirloom tomatoes like Brandywine, are not resistant to it. I think they are. Some of them, quite a few of them are resistant to it. They just haven't been tested to make sure that they're resistant because, again, these seed companies that are growing these hybrids, they're having you come back year after year to get that same variety. Because you remember, if you save seeds out of hybrid, you don't get that same hybrid back. And then the crop rotation there we talked about, it's not going to be a full fire way to do that, but you could try that. They are also actually starting to graft tomatoes now, grafting an heirloom onto the rootstock of, say, a Better Boy, just to get um, through the resistance, some resistance, or keep the verticillium fusarium out of that crop. And that's if somebody's trying to grow some heirlooms and gonna send them to a high-end market, it may be worthwhile to do that. We have late blight. This is the fruit develops dark brown or greenish blemishes. The blemishes can be present on the stem. The leaves kind of get water soaked there. You can see that pepper leaf. This is usually a cool, wet weather disease, which is generally not that big a deal for us because we don't have cool, wet weather that long before it heats up. This doesn't really like hot weather. And this one is really bad because this is the disease that wiped out the potatoes during the potato famine in Ireland. And, they thought they could dig their potatoes and store them. Well, it actually even hit the stuff in storage. So this actually will rot the fruit too, as you can see that eggplant there. So it doesn't just stop from picking, the fruit or whatever harvestable part. It'll rot everything in storage as well. So this is a really hard one to control, but it spreads really fast. The great thing is, it doesn't like our climate, so we don't see it very often. I've seen it one time, an outbreak of it during the growing season. Now it might come in late in the fall, and by then we don't even acknowledge it or even know it's there. It doesn't overwinter here well. either. So, it's a more northern, cooler weather problem, but once it gets started, it runs rampant. But we did have it here in my 1 year in 16 here at the Extension Service. And what happened was we had a cool, wet July that year, and the plants were shipped down from up north, the transplants, and pretty much distributed all over the state. So we did have a little outbreak of this, but as soon as the weather cleared up, it stopped it in its tracks. So if we do have an outbreak, how do you control it? You want to maintain proper fertility, just like with the early blight. Spray your foliage at the first sign of disease, again with the same chemicals, chlorothalonil, maneb, mecazeb, or fixed copper. And remember, fixed copper works better on funguses or on bacteria than funguses, and this is a fungus, so it's going to give you a little bit of control, but not as good as the other ones. And then you're probably going to need to apply this weekly while the weather, especially for late blight, is conducive for it to grow. Use disease-free transplants. Again, the one outbreak we had in this state was from transplants shipped from up north down to us. And then the other thing you might find late blighting is potatoes. If you grow a lot of potatoes, remember they are a cool season crop, and that's where this disease hits hard. So if you've had some of that late blight on your potatoes, you want to make sure you control that before you plant tomatoes and peppers out in that garden. Some other possible diseases, we have Septoria leaf spot. You can see the little spots on the leaf top there. We have anthracnose, which usually attacks fruit there on the bottom left. And we have leaf mold, which is just the gray mold that grows under the leaves. That's usually in high moisture times during the growing season. And then we have bacterial speck. Bacterial speck, obviously, is a bacteria. The Septoria leaf spot, the anthracnose, the leaf mold are all funguses. And then we talked about early blight, which you have every season. Most of the time, people will have early blight, septoria, leaf mold, and anthracnose in their garden all at one time at some point during that growing season. The great thing about they're all controlled pretty much the same way. When you see a few leaves starting on the bottom, pull those off, spray them with the maneb, mecazeb, or chlorothalonil, and make sure you get the bottoms and tops of the leaves and the fruit. And you can pretty much hold those diseases back. You're not going to stop them in their tracks. Our weather's too conducive for them to grow, but you can get a few more weeks of good growth and good harvest out of your tomatoes that way. Now with the bacterial speck, it's much more of an issue in peppers than it is in eggplant and tomatoes. I know how some of you are old enough to remember when we had the thing in the 80s where we were going to grow peppers in Kentucky. Well, this disease is what pretty much stopped that in its tracks in the state, is this bacterial speck. It is going to be generally in wet weather, and that's how it spreads. Once the weather heats up and dries up, it'll kind of slow down or pretty much go away on its own, but it may take your entire plant down as it goes. So once you start seeing some of that speckled look on a fruit or the leaves there, go ahead and spray that with fixed copper. Now, this is the one that fixed copper is going to do the best job for you on because it's a bacteria, and copper kills bacteria. So that's the one that you want to hit with fixed copper. And bugs, here we are. Eggplants are bug magnets. If you've got an eggplant out in your garden, you're going to find out pretty quick whether there are any flea beetles or any other insects in that garden, because they're going to love it. That's the first thing they're going to go to, especially these little flea beetles here, as you can see in the picture. They do love all our solanaceous crops, but they particularly like eggplant and potatoes. They'll prefer eggplant over anything else, so you'll know pretty quick whether you've got some of those out there. They're easy to control, just got to stay on top of them. You can spray with Savin, malathion, or insecticidal soap. You could try exclusion, which would be covered with remade fabric, but that's going to be maybe not the best way to do it, because you're going to have to make sure there weren't flea beetles out on those plants or in that garden before you put the cover over. And also, you're going to have to uncover them to allow for the pollinators to get in to pollinate the plants to make you some eggplants. So other pests, we have the tomato hornworm here. It will also eat all three of these crops. Generally speaking, though, tomatoes, it's going to be its number one thing it's going to eat. Next is going to be eggplant. And then also, obviously, if you've been around tobacco, you know that there's tobacco hornworm, which also it will eat these other solanaceous crops as well. These are large 4-inch long worms. They have a horn on one end, as you can see in the picture there. They eat a lot of foliage, and usually that's whenever we actually even notice they're there. We just have bare stems of tomatoes sticking up. You can use, they're easy to control. You can use hand picking or BT. I generally do hand picking because they're once you learn to spot them, they're quite easy to find. A lot of times you'll see that they're there because of the frass on the ground, and then you can just look up on the plant and you'll find them hanging up there. Just pull them off, throw them on the ground real hard, and you know what that'll do to them. Or you can use a BT if you want to be organic, and you can spray your plants, and that BT will kill them. One thing about them, if you find them in your garden and they have the little white sacs hanging on their backs, don't kill those because they've already been parasitized, and the little wasp that parasitized them will be coming out and eating or parasitizing more of these worms. So if you have the little white cocoons on the back hanging off of it, looks like little pieces of spun cotton, leave those on there because they're already toast. They're not eating anything anymore. Cutworms can be a problem, especially in early spring. We have some cool nights. They'll cut the plant off close to the soil in early spring. To stop this, when you put your transplants out, go ahead and put a piece of, if you know you've had problems with these, I haven't had much issues, but some people have. Use a cardboard collar right at the around the stem at the soil surface. You can also use a little piece of foil around that stem there, and those plants are strong enough to push that off whenever they grow older. So don't worry about that. They'll push that off, but it'll keep them from being able to gnaw through to eat your stems off. Stink bug damage is another one of those things that's going to keep getting worse with the new brown marmorated stink bug that's here. They do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they'll stick their mouth part into your fruit there, and the toxin that they put in there causes these little mottles or speckles, and see the little white marks into the tomato there at the bottom. You can see the light green marks on the pepper there. These are still fine to eat. Some people don't like to eat them. They're not going to bother you. As far as making juice and stuff, I don't worry about it, but it does. If it gets bad enough, it could. That top one's up there, they're pretty bad. You may just toss them out, but um, they're not inedible. It's not going to anything that's going to hurt you. You probably won't even notice it. Some people just don't like the looks of it. The easiest way to control stink bugs is with malathion. It's one of our oldest insecticides and still is one of our best ones for stink bugs and the new stink bug that's here. So if you know you've got a lot of those, go ahead and give a good spray with malathion, and you can knock a lot of these out their first feeding. Here we have root knot nematode. It's another one of those pests that's not that prevalent in our part of the state, but it can be, especially in high tunnels over several seasons. It basically is just a microscopic little worm that lives in the soil. It feeds on the plant roots, and it causes them to be stunted and yellowed, and the plant wilts. And you can see what it does to the roots. It kind of gnarls the roots. Um, Obviously, this is going to stunt the plant. So the way to get rid of that around that is use resistant varieties, and that's going to be noted by an N on your tag. Remember the tomato earlier has the N with it. That means it was big beef. It is resistant to root knot nematodes. And then some people have trouble sites or don't have much yard or don't have good soil or even a place that they can even grow, but they have a balcony. You can use containers to grow these three crops. Some of our vegetable crops are not conducive to containers, but these three are. I would say use the largest container that you can get. Um, Use varieties that are labeled for container gardening. Some of the smaller tomato varieties, most of your eggplants and peppers do just fine in a container, but the large indeterminate tomatoes are just probably too big for most of our containers. So use more of the patio type tomatoes. Also, if you use some of these planters that have the water reservoir, when you fill the bottom of the reservoir with water, that's going to help keep an even moisture flow to these plants, and it's going to reduce your chances of getting blossom end rot because of too much fluctuation in your water uptake. So, has anybody got any questions? You can always call me at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. Happy gardening.